Welcome everyone to this episode of Mixed Extents. My name is Andrew Prosky and I'm here with my co-hosts Mark Wilkinson and Anthony Nocentino. No messing with the names this time, chaps. We're going to take it seriously.
Oh man.
In this episode, the topic is next generation data platforms, and we have four special guests with us today: Argenis Fernandez, Ben Weissman, Chris Adkin, and Melody Zacharias. I never get through the intro without screwing the names up. Anyway, welcome everyone. Two of you have had on the show before: Argenis, a principal architect, and Melody, a senior solutions architect. Both of them data platform MVPs. Both of you work for Pure. Welcome back, Argenis and Melody. We also have Ben joining us. Ben is a data passionist and best-selling author and helped us out by moderating at 8KB last month. Welcome, Ben. And finally, we have Chris, a solutions architect at Pure. First time on the show. Good to have you here, Chris. So let's get started. So topic is next generation data platforms. I'm going to start off with talking about have these new technologies that are coming in, say Docker and Kubernetes, fundamentally changed the way we interact with SQL Server. Example is, does anyone remember the time when we used to have to spin up a whole VM just to test a new version of SQL Server? Now we just have to say Docker run new version of SQL, boom, we're up and away. So are we changing the way we interact with SQL Server due to these new technologies?
I love it how you extrapolate what people do in their laptops to what people actually do in production, Andrew. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say, dude, is, look, yeah, the technology where we're headed is fantastic. The base for it is already there, and we have all the capabilities with containers and Kubernetes and all that with SQL Server, and everything is like changing underneath the hood. But the reality is that in production, everyone is very much running SQL Server on VMs on Windows, like literally everyone and their mother.
Absolutely, but we're still interacting with it differently, though.
Where we're
headed, it is in a development environment.
Oh yeah. On the development environment, that's for sure. Because DevOps pipelines and VMs are like allergic to each other, right? You don't want to mix the two. And Chris has a ton of opinions on this, but I will tell you, if you're using VMs or even bare metal hosts, which I have seen use bare metal hosts on DevOps pipelines, and it's completely and utterly insane. Yet people sometimes are forced to do it. Look, I mean, you should be looking at containers because the agility of containers is just unmatched, period.
So let me hop in on that real quick. So for the folks that are listening that might not have that familiarity or the exposure to, like, what does it mean to use SQL Server in a DevOps pipeline? What does that really look like in the scenarios that you all are seeing in the field?
There's a million of different scenarios for SQL servers to be deployed on pipelines, but largely, how can I validate and quickly test a change that I made to my database? Whether I made a schema change or whether I made a code change of something that's going to hit the database. Right? So
Okay.
the being able to deploy a copy of the database quickly, plus a set of changes, apply the set of changes quickly to a database, are fundamental to keeping that streamlined approach to that a DevOps pipeline kind of entails, right?
Okay.
I think it also greatly depends on the question, what are my use cases, what I'm actually doing with my SQL Server, because still to this point, there is stuff that can be tested in containers and stuff like Kubernetes. Everybody drink super fast because they natively run on Kubernetes. Stuff like big data cluster, drink again. Or am I more doing something like integration services with potentially a ton of third-party components that wouldn't even run in a container because they wouldn't run on Linux because they're Windows only, which basically completely locks me out of that container and or Kubernetes scenario. So depending on what I'm doing and depending on what I'm focusing at, and also depending on what I'm trying to test, this might be a super easy way of getting there because, I mean, like Andrew said, you basically just spin up a new container instead of spinning up a new VM, or even worse, spinning up bare metal and having a from scratch new environment that every time looks exactly the same because it's all scripted, it's all coming out of code, and therefore it will look exactly the same. But that only works if I have something that actually runs in the SQL and Linux world, which still has, I mean, from the engine perspective, it is pretty close to what we get on Windows. From some other perspectives, like integration or even worse, analysis services, there is a small gap there. And by small gap, I mean huge, you know.
Yeah, third-party integrations, I mean, you can look at it from the backup point of view, just alone. Yeah, that's like night and day, right? What you can do on data recovery data encryption, like all of these plugins that work on Windows, zero on Linux. It's just nature of the beast.
What do you mean by
So going back
plugins?
to
You talking?
the thing about pipelines, the beauty of containers is if you've got a CI/CD pipeline, and if you're deploying something a couple of times a day, it's so much more efficient to spin up a container than an entire VM. That's the beauty of containers. The other thing is, the whole Windows Linux debate is, I kind of think that when Microsoft first announced SQL Server on Linux, I don't necessarily think the end goal was the market for people running relational databases on virtual machines, on bare metal, on Linux. I think that the end goal was containers, because despite the fact that Windows has served our community tremendously well, the fact of the matter is, and I don't want Windows people to hate me for saying this, the thing about Linux is it's more of a first-class citizen in the world of containers. And, people have said, in the world of containers and Kubernetes, operating systems take a back seat. Well, the thing is with that is you'll get a lot further with containers based on Linux images than you will on Windows images.
It's pretty clear from the state of the world right now from Microsoft that Linux is the direction for Kubernetes and containers, period. Because there isn't any support for Windows containers at all. Right? Like, good luck trying to find the 2019 Windows container for SQL Server.
No, that seemed to have disappeared. We asked about it, and yeah, apparently the Windows one is just isn't there. But it looks like all the focus now is on Linux.
So what Chris is saying is exactly that on, right? I mean, all the shots are headed in the Linux direction, and what adding to that, what Ben is saying, you kind of start putting the picture together. We kind of have to work around the gaps if we want to implement these kinds of infrastructures. Period. We don't have a choice.
Yeah, I think like from a production, like from the field standpoint, when you look at the shops that are doing DevOps, like actual rollouts and all that fun stuff, and there's SQL Server involved in that, generally what you're seeing is two teams, literally the Linux team and the Windows team that takes care of that static VM-based deployment of SQL Server. And they want, and especially IT leadership, C-level and D-level people, want to bring those two things together and not have two separate teams managing their production environments. And I think a lot of it focuses on the tech, but it also needs to focus on how do you manage these systems at scale. And you can't do that efficiently, or I don't say well, but you can't do that efficiently with two isolated teams. And bringing those two together is a huge part of it with tooling and the technologies that we're seeing come out now.
So I get you guys thinking about the way I see things, and because I was the PM for SQL PAL, as you guys know, and I have a bit more insight from the trenches, I guess, that I could possibly talk about. But I will say this, in my opinion, and this is purely opinion, no fact. I'm not saying anything in DA here. Both SQL Server on Linux and SQL Server on Linux-based containers are transitional products, both of them, because the end goal is Azure Arc.
Oh yeah,
that's really the end goal. That's really what Microsoft would love everyone to land on. That's it. They don't. This whole perpetual licensing thing, they want that to go away.
Yeah, I think the other thing is as well is, I mean, you look at anything in the world and realm of data science, and Steph Locker's said this to me, is again, I'm not disparaging or bashing Windows, but Linux, when it comes to open source analytics and data science tooling, Linux is more of a thing also.
Well, to bring that around to what Anthony had said as well, Chris, just as a whole, recently I did a research study where I did a survey across all research groups, whether it was IT managers that covered DevOps, DBAs, and AI groups. to see what direction that they were going to be going with these technologies. And all of them said they were going to containers, all of them. Over 90% of them said that was the direction they were going to a large extent over anything else, over VMs, over bare metal, over anything, over going to the cloud even. It was going, the direction they were going was containers because it gave them that portability, whether it was for DevOps or for, regardless of what the use case was, it was going to be containers. That was going to be their future for their shops.
I don't think anyone is arguing the fact that the future is all container based, because right now I'm literally working with a customer who is as old fashioned as it can possibly get. And trust me on this one, they are old fashioned, all right? Their mandate from their CIO, they are an extremely large government entity. Okay, so think about that kind of old fashioned.
Oh, is it Space Force? Is it Space Force?
Do they have dot matrix printers?
Yes, actually they do. But let's not.
Oh,
talk
it's Space Force then. All right.
Anyway, the mandate from the CIO of this entity was make everything cloud native, make everything portable, no attachment to anything. And the only way that they can achieve that is, say it with me, Kubernetes. So they're literally just switching their entire infrastructure. They're making everything run on top of containers and including SQL Server. And the problem that they're facing right now is that they have no idea how to do it. They don't. They think that yeah. Anthony said, "Call me." Yeah, I know. I call you and never answered. No wonder.
What?
It's literally that kind of problem, right? So they don't understand how to take a SQL Server database, something that is running heavy, solid, running in there for 10 years, and just shift it all of a sudden into a container model. They have no idea how to do it.
Well, so, in our data world, we can barely get people to move between versions of SQL Server, let alone replatform a SQL Server, right? And that's a huge jump because nobody wants to touch it because it's going to break, right? And so I guess that's the question I always ask the engineering team is you keep pushing new versions. That comes off a little negative there, but new versions keep coming out and we want to adopt those things, but the friction to move between versions is really, really hard,
because
right?
Databases don't work. The databases should work like REST APIs, right? Where you have a version of the API and everything just works the same. Well, guess what? Yeah. Database compatibility is supposed to be that. But it doesn't really quite work like that, does it?
Isn't that something that containers fixes, especially in Kubernetes? Anthony, I've seen you do this in a demo where we go up, take the databases up a version in Kubernetes, doesn't work, roll it straight back down. Which, if you're doing that, if you're patching a VM, ever tried to uninstall a CU? It's real good fun. Love it.
Yeah,
it's called snapshots.
Right.
Yeah. All right.
It does solve that, but I think there's a problem with when it comes to friction. We get onto containers and Kubernetes in the first place, and I've seen this for some organisations I've spoken to teams of DBAs, and they've said to me, "Well, you know, we're kind of aligned to the Wintel teams. If there's anything that's Linux, we don't get to play with that." I mean, having said all that, the change has got to happen at some stage, because if things didn't change, we'd all still be, you know, writing programs on punch cards. So it will happen.
I haven't heard that phrase designated a team for a while now, the Wintel team. I forgot about that, the Windows Intel teams. I was like, oh, well, I want to run SQL on Linux.
Yeah.
How about no?
It's going to pop up again because we got ARM, right?
You can literally tell when there's a technology shift when the thing that you just said happens. You haven't heard about Wintel engineering in a long time. I literally just had a call with a customer on last week, where one of the people that jumped on the line, manager of Wintel engineering. So you see that's just a problem. A lot of people move faster than very few people move faster than the rest of the pack. And when you think about the large coverage area that SQL Server has across the entire industry, across all the different industries, actually, it's such a massively deployed product that shifting all of that into a new model, it's a decade effort.
I'm pretty sure there's people out there still running SQL 2000.
Right. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to die and people will still be running SQL Server 2008 R2. I guarantee you that.
I killed my last 08 R2 last summer, so I have none in my field of vision anymore.
Not you.
The thing is, there's, I mean, sort of pre-pandemic times, I go to quite a few meetups around London, which is a massive development hub in Europe. Go to things like DevOps meetup, Kubernetes meetup, the cloud native meetup. And it kind of seems that in that community, there's a big appetite to lap up open source. They really like to, those people really like to drink from the open source fire hose. And I don't quite think most of the data platform community are quite in the same space as those people. So you go to those kind of things, and it comes to Kubernetes, containers, things like GitOps. Those communities are quite ahead of the curve, and it will happen, and it might be a bit like the polar ice caps shrinking, but the data platform community will make that move, but it might not be as fast as other communities have already sort of made the jump.
So I think you have a problem of what's greenfield, right? What's new applications that are going to be developed for this kinds of infrastructures, and then you have the problem of the existing applications that have to somehow be made adequate for these kinds of infrastructures, because they're not really being translated or moved. They're being made barely adequate so they can run on top of that of the new infrastructure. They're not completely retooled. They're not completely re-architected. Nothing ever is. You end up moving the data from something to something else eventually down the line, but you don't really modify entire databases. Now, I remember Microsoft focusing on migrating people away from Oracle into SQL Server. Like, really, who does that? And there's a lot. I've talked to a lot of customers that are considering like Oracle to Postgres and SQL to Postgres and SQL to and SQL Server to MySQL and MariaDB migrations. But those projects are rarely a thing. I mean, I just don't see them becoming prevalent. So there's that huge footprint that's on SQL Server out there. It'll get eventually migrated to whatever it is, right? Whether containers or Arc or something, it'll eventually land on that. But I think the bigger proposition for the market is, oh yeah, look, Microsoft is playing in this ecosystem, and it's a first-class citizen for Linux and containers, and you should be using this for like, consider using SQL Server for this sort of thing. That kind of message is lost on people, especially in the open source people, where they relate Microsoft with Microsoft from the 90s, right? That's all they think about. They think about Microsoft with the $ replacing the S.
I was about to say the Balmer era.
Yeah,
right.
That's how I know who I'm talking to when they spell it with the $.
No, I really don't want to get into that conversation. Right? Look at the stock price. That's all I care about. And I don't even own stock anymore. So point is, people really, there is really a problem with what should I use for my database for my greenfield project that I'm working on? Because if I'm somebody who just got out of college, I'm gonna go play with CockroachDB because that's cool and it sounds cool and I have no idea how it works, but I'm gonna use it anyway because it sounds better than SQL Server and Microsoft. You know what I mean?
CockroachDB, is that a thing?
It really is. Yep.
Very much a thing. So and yeah, you can't just step on it and have it die. No, it doesn't work like that. I'm serious though. This is a problem. Like, people in general are not seeing SQL Server as that one thing that they're going to be leveraging for cloud native, and I don't think they get the value proposition of something that's been made rock solid from 30 years of engineering. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a hard position to come at folks with. And I literally made this joke yesterday via text message, is that I had a customer once come at me and say, hey, Facebook runs MySQL. And I'm like, yeah, Facebook's got a floor full of PhDs to support that MySQL platform, right? Yeah. And you have 30 years of engineering behind this product and the support of an organization to hold up this platform. It's just apples and oranges, right?
Go ahead.
So that's a great point. That is that the organisations sometimes they conflate themselves with, you know, as you said, the Facebook's organizations have got absolute legions of developers. Remember that scene in the last Lord of the Rings film, with the gates of Mordor open, you see like the massed armies of Sauron. It's a bit like that, but you know, they're not orcs, they're developers, software engineers, and yeah, it's, you know, what's the problem you're trying to solve here? Are you a 10, 20 person IT shop, or are you a behemoth of a software engineering based organization like a Google, like a Facebook, like an Apple, like a Twitter?
So that kind of touches. Let's bring it back around to one of the first comments by Argenis. Was we're talking about development here, and everyone, you know, people who use, not everyone, but some people are using containers and Kubernetes in CI/CD pipelines. Do we see people going to SQL Server in Kubernetes in production? And if they are, would it be like vanilla Kubernetes, or would they be implementing something like big data clusters or Azure Arc and Microsoft pushing people that way? Or do you reckon people would just deploy straight to a Kubernetes cluster, whether it be built on their own or using a managed service like AKS, EKS, or GKE?
I guess it depends on the type of organization. So if you break it down into two parts, obviously you've got people who are going to the public cloud, and as we all know, if you're using SQL Server, there's a massive pull to Azure, which is, I think, is much stronger than, you know, the sort of pull to competing public clouds. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is people are doing stuff on premises, and if you're doing stuff on premises, if you want commercial support, if you work in a regulated industry, so that might be banking, it might be energy and utilities, at the moment, there's only really one place to go, and that is that's OpenShift from Red Hat.
Yep. I mean, I'll put it to you guys this way. I haven't seen anyone go to production in SQL Server on Kubernetes on anything other than OpenShift. Literally 100% of the deployments that I've seen SQL Server on Kubernetes have gone to OpenShift.
For major applications, yes. I've seen a couple of like microservices and stuff where I've even seen people go to something like super plain vanilla kubeadm stuff. But so, I mean, that's one of the beauties of that is not just for CI/CD, but also in production, how easy and lightweight you can set it up. And if you're just running some kind of a microservice doing whatever, potentially just something feeding a display that sits up in the corner in the room or whatever, that is not super business critical, where you do not need enterprise level support from Red Hat or whoever might provide it. That might something that starts on kubeadm and will stay on kubeadm forever. Whenever you need something with business critical support, and obviously when we're talking about products like big data clusters, no one's going to deploy a big data cluster just to use it as a microservice, because big data cluster is anything but lightweight. I mean, the containers alone are like 30 something gigs.
The container images are 30 gigs.
32.
Ouch.
Wait,
okay.
For what? For BDC?
Yes.
There's a ton of open source stuff in there.
Yeah.
I mean, you have the SQL Server, you have the Spark
30
part.
gig for a container image isn't big. It's
it's not
like
one container
gigantic.
image. It is. But
it's split across multiple. Okay. All right.
You have like 12-ish images, and they in total make up for. But the biggest one is the SQL Server image, and I think it has like 15-ish gigs.
Well, I must admit it's a bit pot kettle black here, because I did build a SQL Server 2012 container image and put it on Docker Hub, and that was 22 gigs. So I don't know why I'm complaining about anything.
There's a your meme is so fat joke in there somewhere.
Somewhere in there. I remember one of my friends went to pull it down and went, "What's going on with this?" He was like, "Oh yeah, it's 22 gig," and I can't repeat the response I got from him.
So here's another thought. from just a bare, I'm starting to deploy my infrastructure on the dev environment, right, with the eyes on going to production somewhere. Windows doesn't even have a developer edition. It's never had one. And all you get from Windows is the time-bombed eval version if you wanted to deploy stuff on dev. So that right there turns you off, right? Like if I'm going to, look at brand new, the last thing I think about is Windows. So I go to Kubernetes, right? And what am I, because that's not the logical thing where people do extremes, right? People don't land in the middle. People either go Windows or they just look for the new fancy thing. If they're going to switch to something new, they might as well go to whatever is en vogue, right? That's kind of how it works. So I'm going to deploy on dev. What do I look at? Do I do like Ubuntu? I know I like Ubuntu, but guess what? If I'm going to run OpenShift in production, I'm not going to do Ubuntu in dev and then do OpenShift in production. That to me will be crazy. So people go like, okay, so what do we do? CentOS? Oh wait, CentOS is not supported for SQL. Oh wait, CentOS went through all this whole thing debacle now, where it's now upstream and not downstream. So what do I do? And this is where people fundamentally don't know there's even an OpenShift version that's free for development. You can get OpenShift for development for free. So that's interesting. People don't know these things, and they make all these fundamental mistakes on the different pieces of the infrastructure, on the different environments, because they don't know.
But do you seriously think that people would steer away from Windows just because that there's no dev test license? Because my point is, and again, it depends on what I'm doing. If I'm doing just that small microservice, that might be significant extra cost. But in the terms of that big applications, I'm moving away from my Dynamics on-prem to whatever it may be. The cost of that whole project, the fact that I'm buying or not buying an extra Windows license for my dev test system.
I'm thinking of revamping, right? So if I'm thinking of revamping, I'm not thinking Windows. And I'm sorry, but this is the situation that Windows has set themselves on. They have literally taken the approach of not investing as much into the whole Kubernetes infrastructure. That's why Windows doesn't play here anymore. This is all Windows is doing. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is.
No need to apologize. I'm not Windows, so we're still friends.
I mean, because this opinion is harsh, but it's the truth, right? So
I think that everyone has said that like the writing's on the wall, right, when it comes to Windows, and we see it as practitioners in the field, and you get a lot of folks that are still trying to do the Windows Kubernetes, Windows containers thing, and you have 22 gig images, and large image size isn't just a joke. That's a practical matter and how fast you can deploy and how fast you can manage a platform. So like if you're not familiar with container image size, it actually is a primary consideration. And so this is where we are, right? This is the transition point. Oh, go ahead.
I have a problem with that. And I guess the problem is like, how much smaller do you want your containers to be? Like, what makes you happy? Like, if you have a 500 meg container, does that make you happy?
Let's say this. The analogy is, what do you consider a very large database? Well, it's a very large database when it becomes challenging to work with, right? And given your infrastructure constraints. And that same practical approach would apply to container image. It becomes an issue when it becomes practically challenging to work with, right? If I have to pull a 22 gig container image and my infrastructure only supports, right, exactly. Yeah.
Where are you pulling from?
And I've had this debate with the product team about pulling images. They're like, well, pre-pull the images on the individual nodes. I'm like, well, that sounds silly. Why would I want to do things like that? Why would I want to position the assets adjacent to my infrastructure, right? Rather than do this extra step of pre-pulling things. So yeah, the container image size thing goes back to that. When does it become practically challenging given your constraints?
That's a massive point. That if I have node failure, you spin up a new node, you drain the node, and your pods all come up on the new node, and you've forgotten to pre-pull your image, and you're sitting there waiting for that container image. It's basically eaten into your recovery time. That's a massive problem if there's big container images.
So look, this is why on-prem is still very much relevant, and this is why we up here are still selling a lot of stuff. Our solutions are helping with a lot of these problems, right? I need to load a big fat container fast. That's very much a thing.
Well, that's a huge practical consideration that we're not even touching on. We're focused on data
I get you,
movement.
but I think the model is broken fundamentally. Like, if you have to stream your executables from the internet all the time, you're doing it wrong. Let's face. This is not Netflix, all right? So it's a different proposition when you're trying to run your core code for your application from something that sits on the internet. So I mean, proxying things, caching things, that becomes really very much a thing.
Totally.
And so the product team is not wrong when they said that should be an approach. It's just that the model is broken right now. That needs to shift into something different.
Well, I'd 100% say you need to put all your container images into a private container registry, albeit that hosted on premises or in the cloud. Streaming directly off the internet and running that is, I'm going to take this and run it in my production environment. Don't really know what's in it, but let's just give it a whirl, shall we? No, that is a terrible idea.
That is the first mistake, putting a dependency on the internet for stuff.
Yes.
Like, what if you're not online?
There's a great article, and we'll add it to the links. One of the PMs over containers or AKS, I forget exactly which group in Microsoft, goes through that. Like when Docker made that shift to go from totally free to partially paid, they published a paper that goes through like all the different challenges and why you should and how you should position your assets, both from a tech standpoint and a security standpoint. So we'll add that to the links to kind of go deeper into that conversation.
I had a semi-related question. So all this talk about these new platforms and all the challenges they bring along. What about the traditional SQL shops that don't really want to go to a containerized platform? Do you think they're going to get left behind? I mean, I know one of the arguments obviously would be we've still got people running SQL 2000, SQL Server 2000, but is there going to be a point where like they're just not going to be getting the same feature sets, or like what are people's thoughts on that?
We had this conversation, didn't we, Argenis? We had this conversation, and you made the point. And I mean, this isn't based. I don't think this is based off any inside knowledge, and it's definitely not betraying any NDAs. But I think in terms of the innovation, I mean, you want. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay.
Oh no, I was listening because of the NDA-ness of things. Sorry.
Yeah, you'll say NDA, and his ears perk up. So
yeah.
Safety first.
You look at so you've got Azure Managed SQL instances, not for data services, Postgres, hyperscale. It wouldn't surprise me if other things make the jump from, being things you can only find on native Azure at the moment onto Azure Arc for data services. So I think in terms of the core database engine, if you still want to run on Windows, I don't think you're going to miss out. I think where you're going to miss out is in terms of the wider Azure data platform landscape. That's where, I mean, you look at, Ben made the comment about all the things in big data clusters, all the open source stuff. You're not going to, I mean, Spark on Windows, I can't ever see that being a thing.
So, realistically, what makes more money today? That's all I want you guys to think about. Deprecating something that's making billions of dollars a year, it's not happening. All right, it's just not happening. And you're also not telling people, oh yeah, you need to move. Microsoft is not Oracle. You know what I mean? They don't work like that. It's going to take a long time for whoever is running a legacy to shift to whatever is next. You guys remember how the mainframe didn't die? Because they didn't die. They still sell a lot. IBM still cranks out a new mainframe every so often. They do. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that model of running SQL Server will still be with us 25 years from now. I'm not even kidding. Because that's how long SQL Server in 2019 is going to be supported for. It's 22, 23 years with extended support and lawsuits and blah, blah, blah. It'll be there that long. I'm not kidding. This is true. I mean, I may throw some funny statements in there. It may sound funny, but it's true. SQL Server will be around for a really long time. There will be people running SQL Server on Windows and like forever. It's true. But anyway, go ahead.
Football. So, I mean, really, if that's still happening, what does that say about SQL Server's lifespan?
I saw people talking about Vaxes on Twitter the other day. Vax. People are running Vax.
Yeah.
Has anyone on the call actually worked on a mainframe?
Oh,
I worked with a PDP-11.
Wow.
You're about the same age as a PDP-11.
It was operational.
It was supposed to be the other way around, meaning he was. Never mind, I messed that up.
we're getting nasty now, Anthony.
He's trying to get nasty. He's too
No,
nice.
no. I was trying to be nice about it. Not me. I was trying to indicate that he's too old or too young to have worked with a PDP-11.
Yeah, that's totally how that came across.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Original backbone of the internet. True.
Yeah. No, I think that with Arc, that's definitely the way that things are going to be going. I mean, even if you think about it now with SQL Server and Synapse, there's so many things in Synapse that as a practitioner, I would love to have my hands on that, if I'm not part of the cloud ecosystem or my customer's not a part of the cloud ecosystem, that they would like, that I would like them to do within Synapse, that, if they don't have their data in there, they can't do. So they have to have their data in the cloud to really access the amazing things that Synapse does, right? So that's almost like an incentive right there for them to put their data in the cloud.
PaaS is the next level of lockdown, right? Because once you put your data on PaaS, because you want to leverage those fancy PaaS features, that's where you're kind of like
PaaS. Or as we know where I work, Pablo has a service.
They have a coworker named Pablo. Well, Melody, do you envision those services like Synapse extending into Arc-enabled data services or vice versa? Like, what's your, like, in that landscape, where do you see things landing?
Well, I think it's going to be, opening up all those options with Arc, right? You're going to be able to reach all of those people who really want to keep their data on-prem or have to keep it for security or compliance reasons on-prem, but then they're going to be able to reach and give you that true hybrid cloud. So if you look at the research and the trends, if you look at like Gartner and companies that do all of that research as to the directions that things are going, and even if you look at Satya's keynote from Ignite, he says that hybrid is the future. We're no longer just strictly on-prem or in the cloud. We are a hybrid society. And that's really what Arc is. It allows you to have your data wherever you need it to be, whether it's on-prem, in the cloud, or on the edge. And wherever you need your data to be, you can access every service you need. So it's data mobility is the future. And that's what containers gives us, right?
I think there's still tons of gaps on the whole Arc story because it's so new. It's so like, it's not even out yet. So let's begin with that.
But what is
I
out?
guess
There's
on
a book
something
out.
that's not even GA.
Exactly. Like I'm here telling myself, dude, you have been hearing about this for a long time, but most people haven't. Okay, fair enough. But I'm saying if Arc wants to be like a huge hit, it has to close on a lot of gaps on the story out there. And I think one of the more fundamental issues with Arc is getting data in and out of Arc. Because that's just the thing, right? You can't just say, "Oh yeah, ADF will fix everything. We'll run ADF on top of Azure Arc, and that'll be it." No, dude, that is not it, right? Like that story needs to be made a lot nicer, a lot better, I think. Anyway, but we'll see what comes out. Because
let's have Anthony's and Ben's response to this.
Melody, I think Melody wanted to grab it. Go ahead,
Ben's got something as well.
I was just going to say that just like anything else, there's that movement of data in and out, but just like containers, it's going to be all of those services around it that are going to determine how robust the service is. So I think the future is going to be that container and Arc story, but it's the services around it that are going to determine how robust that whole ecosystem is and determine how robust that service is in the future. Sorry.
Ben,
Okay,
Ben.
I'll bite
Okay.
Ben and Nancy. I don't know anything about Arc in any way, shape, or form. Where could I learn about Arc?
I mean, I hear it's a super hot topic. I mean, it's not even out yet. And from what I've seen, there is a book on Azure Arc enabled data service that is #1 in new releases on SQL Server. So I don't know how that. I mean, that must be some really cool authors there that actually published something on a product that hasn't even been out yet, because that means by the time whoever buys that book, Argenis, everything he's going to read in there is completely outdated.
It's okay. I just wanted to have the alpha version of it.
So when I see you in 2025, I'm totally going to sign it for you. No.
So for everyone listening who doesn't know, Anthony and Ben have written a book on Azure Arc. And they can get that book on Amazon and every online bookstore, every good online bookstore, and probably some bad online bookstores as well.
Very much so. But if I may clarify, because we did not write about Azure Arc, but we wrote about Azure Arc enabled data services. And with a serious side note here, for those that have not heard about Arc yet, that is a big difference, because Arc is multiple things. It's actually 4 different product lines, if you want. So there's Arc Server, for example, and there's Arc enabled data services. And comparing those two is like comparing an Azure VM to Azure SQL DB. It both kind of runs in Azure. It both kind of has Azure in its name, but a part of that, it has nothing in common. So the idea of Arc-enabled data services is that running on Kubernetes, on any infrastructure, any Kubernetes. So if I'm doing that on-prem, if I'm doing it in the Azure cloud, if I'm doing it in the Amazon cloud, I'm deploying Kubernetes and I'm deploying containers in there using AZ Data, the Azure Data CLI, which will deploy a big container. Well, see, there we go with names and stuff, because I'm calling it a container. It's not a container, but it's kind of a, Anthony, help me out for the lack of a better word.
Virtual?
What is the data controller? It's a huge pothole. Let's use that if you want to. And within that pothole, you start, not pothead, pothole. You start deploying your application. And the nice thing about that is you spin up, like you could spin up right now SQL Server in a container, SQL Server in Kubernetes, but you're not just spinning up a regular SQL Server or Postgres hyperscale, but you're spinning up a managed instance, which means, and some of that is not in the product yet because we're in public preview at this stage. But at some point, you will have all that automated backups, automated updates, all the stuff that you get from the PaaS offering, but you get it on your own infrastructure. And this is the beauty of Azure Arc in about 17 minutes.
I love the idea of Azure Arc data services. Azure Arc enabled data services. I actually have to look up the name because that's
where's the hyphen?
It keeps changing, so.
But it reminds, yeah, I know that keeps changing. Trust me, I was there for that.
The old AADS, of course.
So this literally reminds me of Always On. You remember when Always On first came out? It was like mirroring, clustering, and availability groups all into one. Always On, and now it's like Azure Arc. So what is Azure Arc? Oh, there's data services, there's Kubernetes management, and there's VM management. Oh, okay. Just Microsoft and naming things. Naming things is hard.
So let's dive into the practicalness of Azure Arc enabled data services a little bit. So now
organically, Anthony.
Yeah. We can get SQL Server primarily 3 different ways now, right? As a cloud PaaS offering, on-prem in traditional installations, and now we have this Azure Arc enabled data services thing. So now you have a product team, an engineering team like Microsoft that's got to keep up and maintain effectively what I would envision as 3 different platforms, and they're just adding to that complexity. Do we see one of these kind of pulling away from the other, one slipping behind from an engineering standpoint? Because that's a huge surface area of engineering and deployment to manage. So do we see, like, basically, or is one of these going to get a little more TLC than the others going forward, right?
I have opinions on that. I guess the first thing I'll say is, if you really think about it, if you really think about it, core database engine is core database engine.
Mm-hmm.
There's that work will continue to be done. Whatever needs to be done, there will be contributions from the big data clusters team. There will be contributions from the traditional SQL Server on Windows and Linux-based containers, and even Azure IaaS VMs. There will be contributions to that core database engine. There will be contributions to the core database engine from the Azure SQL guys, the ones, the PaaS folks, and that's just the way it goes, right? So they want to maintain that core database engine is core database engine thing going, because it enables all the different branches of of product, right? It enables Arc, it enables
Okay.
big data clusters, it enables SQL Server and VMs and bare metal and stuff. How much longer are they going to keep it that way? I don't know, dude. It seems to be working out really well.
Yeah, but you can see that like having, yes, 80% of this thing or some arbitrary number is core database engine. That's, SQL Server, yada, yada. But that's just this idea of Arc, though, is to attack that multi-platform hybrid problem that I have all these things to deal with. And really what we're doing is just adding another platform that we have to take care of and feed, right? And that's going to maybe a negative way to view that, but we've all seen that in the past where we get this thing where it's supposed to replace the whole universe of existing things and we just have a new standard now or a new thing that we have to take care of. So
what you're saying is it's like there's 13 competing standards and someone says, oh, we need a standard to correlate all these, and you end up with 14 competing standards.
Nope.
So it's the same with platforms. We have 3 competing platforms. One of them is going to pull away, maybe. I don't know. I'm kind of with Argenis on this, that the core database engine will stay the core database engine, and you're just going to get different features in each.
So
the economics of that are going to keep it that way for a long time, as he's mentioned.
The way that
earlier.
I think about it is over time, SQL Server on Windows, SQL Server on Linux-based containers, and SQL Server on Linux itself, it's going to like kind of taper off, and people are going to end up moving more and more stuff to Arc. And what's actually on Arc are non-service fabric aware versions of whatever runs on Azure. How about that? So the services that run on Azure all run on Service Fabric on Azure, right? On-prem, they run on top of Kubernetes because, Service Fabric on-prem never happened. Although Microsoft still would like it to happen, will never happen. The point is, you will get discrete products that match one-to-one to whatever you're running on cloud, and then you will have all of that extra stuff that is more like the legacy stuff. But where Microsoft will really want you to land is on Azure Arc. And what can they do to help you get there? Licensing. They can make it easier for you to land on Azure Arc. They can give incentives to run on Azure Arc. Right? They can do all sorts of things to get you running there. And they'll probably do it. I can definitely see it happening.
Do you think that's the push then? Is not for people to deploy on, say, on-premises Kubernetes or use AKS, but if you want to, the eventual migration will be everything into either big data clusters or Azure Arc and manage everything through that way. And just that basically slaps a layer of abstraction over the Kubernetes cluster. Because I imagine when people say like big data clusters, when they first came out, you had to deploy your own. I haven't touched one for a while now, but you had to build your own cluster and things like that. I imagine it's a lot more abstracted. So you just say like, deploy this here for me. And that's where we're going, where it's sort of like there's a veneer, a shine over the ins and outs of what's going on, and people can just use a nice interface to interact with it.
I mean, for BDC, that's pretty much unchanged. I mean, what they did and what they've built, like right now, in the beginning, you had to deploy through AZ Data from the command line, and they've brought up all that stuff in Azure Data Studio, which will then potentially build up an AKS cluster for you. But in the end, all that Azure Data Studio does for you is call the Azure CLI, call AZ Data for you. So the general concept is still the same. You're building your own Kubernetes cluster and you're deploying to that cluster. So that is one of the huge differences. BDC is part of the SQL 2019 box product. So BDC is completely self-managed, potentially not for the infrastructure part if you're running it on an Azure VM, but a part of that, you're running that show, you're running that product, and it's not any kind of as a service thingy. And that is why we're seeing, I mean, Melody was like, well, I'd like to get my hands on Synapse, but I got customers that are only on-prem. And product team, if you're listening, I'm sorry, I know you disagree, but I mean, and Chris, we've had that discussion a couple of times. Those that are moving towards the cloud are looking at Synapse, and those that cannot move to the cloud but need a similar feature set are looking at BDC, because if you look at it from the high level, if you look at the data pools and the storage pools and the polybase and stuff, they're implemented in different ways, but they're solving and attacking very similar problems. And therefore, if I'm in an industry where I cannot move out of my on-premise environment, or at least out of my private cloud, I may never end up on Synapse. I mean, who knows? Maybe at some point there will be Azure Arc Synapse, but that will probably be a bit down the road, couple of years or decades or never from now. So this is kind of where they are competing, and still you're self-managing. That means you're still creating your own cluster. And even if Azure Data Studio initially deploys that AKS cluster for you, a part of the question if AKS is really where I want to run my BDC, because we've just said, well, that's mainly for those that are not running in the cloud. And spoiler alert, AKS is totally in the cloud. You would still be responsible for maintaining it. So even if somebody wrote that one line of code for you in a notebook to deploy that cluster, you may still want to have 1 or 2 people in your team that have the skill set to make sure this thing stays up to date.
So am I allowed to use the A word and the S word in this show? I mean, Amazon and Snowflake, because we haven't talked about those models for deployment of SQL Server. Like Amazon has Outposts, you can run RDS on Outposts, and you can, guess what, run your EKS infrastructure, whatever it's called on their side, on top of Outposts, and then run Arc on top of that. And then, you know what? There's also Snowflake, and Snowflake also handles a lot of data too, and it's kind of competing with Synapse, and that is probably going to come on-prem at some point. And I have no insight into that, by the way. So all I'm saying is it's a lot more complex than we make it to be here, because we seem to be talking bubble, Microsoft bubble, and the ecosystem is like huge.
I mean, cloud in that sense, that's the one thing I've learned watching cloud as a business is what you just described. Is the big players, they're all competing with each other, making competing services and products. So they basically, effectively, I think, easier to get new customers or retain existing customers from going away from their platforms. And so you're going to see everybody kind of dabble in the same services. But as Chris said earlier, if I'm doing SQL Server, I'm going to do it in the Microsoft cloud or in the Microsoft ecosphere, because it makes sense because of the support and all that fun stuff. But you're right. There's a whole nother universe of things that we don't get exposed to because of the communities that we operate in.
I tweeted this a long time ago. Databases are like religion. Create a new one and make a lot of money.
Okay, well, let's set up that call after this call. We'll talk more.
Yeah.
A new database.
So we're coming to nearly the end of the show. Just so we always ask this question. I have a final question. I just mentioned it earlier that Azure Arc there's certain gaps in it and things like that. What feature would you want to see in, say, not even Arc, but in products in general, like BDC, or if there's something missing in like SQL Server when it's running on Kubernetes for everyone? What would you like to see out there if you had your choice, it deployed tomorrow?
We don't have enough time to talk about my list. It's
the
top
most
of the list,
important one,
Argenis.
number one. What's number one?
Really quickly.
Of course.
So for me, I'd like to see Microsoft absolutely bust their collective humps to move as many services to Arc for data services as possible. So, you think of the popular ones, Cosmos DB might be in there. It's give people the option of being able to run the Microsoft data platform ecosystem wherever they want to run it, not just stop at Azure SQL managed instances and Postgres hyperscale. It's a very good start, but I really hope that Microsoft take it a hell of a long way further than that. That's me.
I'll let Melody go with her wishes first before I.
Well, I think it's
my frustrations.
I want Synapse for Azure Arc.
I do too. So, but you know what I want? Like seriously, when you look at how big enterprises, and I mean really big enterprises, run their SQL Server-based infrastructures, they do a lot of things to make their operational challenges a lot more efficient, a lot more streamlined. And one of them is storage-based operations. And me being a storage guy, that's what I want. I want the storage story work the exact same way on Arc as it does on Windows. Like right now on Windows, I can take a snapshot of a 30 terabyte database, right, on the storage side, and I can do all sorts of fancy things with that. There is no snapshot story on Linux. There's zero. And that's a huge challenge, right?
Is that solely because of the gap of VSS not existing in the Linux ecosystem?
What I think that's my first gripe, right? Like VSS should die. Whatever happens on Linux should be a native to Linux thing. It shouldn't be a port of VSS. That would be insane.
Sure. Yeah.
But that story of like storage-based snapshots and all of that sort of stuff has to be there.
Yeah,
for
that's
very
honestly
large data sets. I mean, there is no logically replicating 30 terabytes of data without somebody screaming and going nuts. Right?
That's my biggest one too, because if you look at the gap, backup, restore, and data gravity, like just the fact of having Titanic databases. That's like number one. And then it's fundamentally juxtaposed against containers and Kubernetes and all the portability of that in general, right?
As the data sets grow larger, our ability to deal with them decreases. And we need all of this stuff to be, you need to be able to say, I have a storage layer or whatever layer. It doesn't have, you don't even have to call it storage. I have a deferred layer that handles certain operations for me, decentralized things. Because, this monolithic, architectural paradigm that we used to live under, it's gone. We need to move on. And I think this is an important part of the piece or the cake here.
Data gravity?
Your data is fat, very fat.
Right.
Oh, Ben, over to you, man. What would you like to see?
I'm actually still going through that list in my head and ticking off all this stuff where I know it's never going to happen because it can't. I mean, like I said, I'm still doing tons of integration services work despite integration services being dead for 5+ years. I mean, nobody does that anymore. And it turns out some people are. And we're actually doing, I would say 90% of ETL work still with SSIS over Azure Data Factory and other ETL tools. Mainly also because a ton of stuff we're doing is on-prem, despite on-prem also being dead. So at some point I will just be out of work overnight because people will realize all I'm doing has been completely outdated and the new stuff I wrote on is not ready yet. But joking, like for example, I would like to see full integration services support for third-party components on Linux. Never going to happen for a bunch of obvious reasons. So if I go down all that way to the list, I would probably like to see transaction-aware data pools in big data clusters, but I would probably have to elaborate a little bit on that, and we may run out of time if I start talking about that. I'll be back for that in the next episode where we're talking about transaction awareness in the data pool in BDC. Stay tuned.
Ben, I would like
we
to
can't
join
wait.
you on that.
Okay, I think we're coming up to the hour, so we're going to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to Melody, Ben, Argenis, and Chris. I'm Andrew Prosky, here with Anthony Nocentino and Mark Wilkinson. Bye for now. See you again.
Right. Thanks, y'all.